We're good, we're good, we're good. All righty. Let's go ahead and start with our review. Again, we're too far in the book to review the whole book as a whole at this point, but just kind of flashing back to what we've been looking at in the chapter we're in now for the third Wednesday night of this. We've already looked at two big issues, one being the Sabbath year, giving the land a rest. And then we've also been talking at length, keep coming back to it, the year of Jubilee, where the land is restored to its original owners and so forth. In both cases, both the Sabbath and the Jubilee, the redemption of the land or its restoration have been the primary focus, the two big components. Either buying it back or giving it a rest so that it can recover. As we saw last time, rules related to the kinsman redeemer play a huge part in that. And we thought a little bit about the Rook of Ruth and Boaz. And then we saw as part of that bigger picture, the kinsman redeemer, is this idea of taking care of family members as being also part of the covenant relationship with God. Right? Big picture, what are the two great commandments? Love God, love neighbor. That's covenant language. And so we've been following that throughout as we've worked our way through this book in this chapter. Tonight we're starting in chapter 25, verse 35 to the end. So let's go ahead and turn there, read along with me. We'll do one paragraph at a time like we always do, so we can at least be somewhat fresh in our minds what we've just read. Verse 35. If your brother, so here's that family language again. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. And so just focusing on that first verse or first paragraph for a little bit. This is, again, tying all this land, all this Jubilee stuff together now. The way to prevent the sale of any tribal land. Somebody in your family unit goes broke. They have to sell the tribal land that they're living on. The way to prevent even getting to that point, so you don't need a kinsman redeemer, is support your brother in need. If you see somebody in the family in trouble, help them. Keep them from getting to the point of losing everything. The particular case or example that God provides through Moses here in verse 35 is that of the case of the one who finds himself in poverty. For the brother who finds himself in poverty. Now, what's the proof, according to verse 35, that he's in poverty and needs help? He has the inability to maintain, or, to use a synonym here, provide for himself. Daily basic needs are not being met because he's spending all his money to pay for everything else. This is not a standard of living. Oh, I'm going down a standard of living. This is like I'm barely surviving living kind of stuff at the moment. And so what the family ought to do is, again, to prevent the sale of the land in the first place, is treat him with hospitality as they would strangers. Now, that sounds odd in our ears, to say treat him with hospitality. We think hospitality, we think a hospitality committee. Or we think hospitality, you're going to come over, we're going to do a Bible study at my house, we'll provide the drinks and snacks. In the ancient world, and still today in the modern Middle East, among ethnic Middle Easterners, hospitality is vital. It's a sign of your love for your neighbor. It's a matter of disrespect if you don't offer hospitality. This helps make a little sense, and I use the word little, a little sense of the story of Lot when the angels come to him in Sodom. The crowd wants to rape the men. He brings them to his house. They're threatening to break down the doors. And Lot does something that just offends all of our moral sensibilities. What's he do? Take my daughters. And we go, what father would do that? In their culture, not protecting his guests was worse than offering up his daughters. That just shows you, not that he wants his daughters to get manhandled, but it shows you how high of a priority he's placed on taking care of his visitors. That he's willing to risk something valuable to him to protect them. This is why in the New Testament, all the general epistles almost, 2 John, 3 John, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, Jude, all of them are constantly dealing with the problem of false teachers in the first century. But the problem was the false teachers traveled from town to town, and they showed up at your house or your church and said, hey, I'm a friend of the Apostle Paul. And you were expected to let them in and treat them well. And if need be, give them money when they finally do leave to help them make the next shop. And so here it is. This is not treat your brother to a meal and have him come in one day. It's if a sojourner comes to your house, what do? You open the house, you give him a room, you loan him the clothes, whatever he needs, you make him feel like part of the family. So when I say hospitality here in verse 35, what are they really being told by Moses? If your brother comes to you in need, can't pay his bills, can't take care of himself or his family, let them live with you. Because that's what you would do with the sojourner or the visitor. Notice, by the way, a lot of these folks are treating strangers better than family. And here's God's way of fixing that. If you're going to treat the visitor this well, shouldn't you treat your family members better? Moreover, he goes on to say, and again, it tells you either it's already happening in Israel or it happens around them, and God's wanting to keep it from happening in Israel. When you let your brother come in or if you reach out and help him, you're not to profit from his poverty. The specific example verse 36 gives is you cannot charge him interest on any money that he borrows. Now, we could use an analogy here, though, from the book of Ruth. The man who was supposed to be the true kinsman redeemer, who had already dropped the ball because he wasn't doing it anyway, when he says to Boaz, I'll do it, and Boaz says, oh, well, wait a minute. That also means you have to bring in Ruth and provide for her and give the family land back one day. What was the man's response? I'm out. He counted the costs and decided it was going to cost him too much money to do it. He was willing to be the kinsman redeemer if he profited from it. And so this forbids it. You're not doing it to get favor, not doing it to get money. You're doing it, as verse 36 says, as a matter of respect for God. Covenant language. You're doing it out of the fear of God. You're in a relationship with them because you're in a relationship with him. And your relationship heavenward ought to be reflected in your relationships earthward. Is God charging you interest? Did God bring you in when you were broke? Then you ought to do the same for others. Verse 37 reminds us how important that concept is. It expands on that idea, already introduced in verse 36, adds a little bit more to it, and says the rule applies not only to money, but also food. Big picture is what are you supposed to do for family members in trouble? Get them out of trouble. This is something we see the early church doing in Acts chapter 2 and again in Acts chapter 4. What they're advocating in Acts 2 and 4 is not communism or socialism. What they're saying is, I recognize that Brian has a need and I have a luxury. I'm going to sell the luxury to get Brian out of trouble. I'm not giving Brian half of everything I own. That's communism. But if I can help Brian, I'm going to do whatever it takes to help him. Postpone the family vacation this year or whatever to help the brother in need. And so verse 37 just says it's bigger than just money. Don't think, oh, I can't charge interest, but I can make him pay me back more food later. No, the idea is you're not in it to make a buck from your relative or fellow brother. Verse 38 then kind of wraps up the beginning of this thought by using the same exact language that's used to introduce the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. I'm the Lord your God who brought you up by a strong hand out of the land of Egypt. You're entering this covenant because I rescued you. So what's he saying here? You're going to keep these rules. Why? Because I've rescued you. This regulation that we're looking at relates to your relationship with God. If you're in a relationship with God, it changes all your other relationships with humans. In fact, that's one of the ongoing themes in the book of Proverbs. Solomon starts with relationship with God, correct? Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Choose wisdom, not folly. And then many of the rest of the Proverbs are about if you're in this relationship, here's what it looks like in other relationships. Again, what's our favorite C word? This is covenant language. This is a matter of your relationship with God. You're getting nothing by taking care of the person in need. You're doing it because you're in a relationship with God and he's already done it for you. Too much has been given, Jesus says. Much is required. The parable of the talents. And so, this is what brotherly love is supposed to look like. Now, let's read that next paragraph. It's a little longer. If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner. He shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own clan and return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but shall fear your God. As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy them from among the strangers who sojourn with you, and their clans that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make them make slaves of them, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly. Here we are living in the American South, post-civil rights era, and we're going, and so we've got to read this section carefully. Let's see what's really being communicated. It's not as bad as we're prone to want to see it. It also doesn't mean what our predecessors 160 years ago thought it meant. Because you're going, as you read it, 150, 160, 200 years ago, Christians in the American South went, yeah, exactly. They're reading it just like you, and they're not offended by it. They're encouraged by it. Both require a misreading of the text. So let's kind of walk through and see what's going on in this paragraph. This paragraph now is going to address cases of extreme poverty. He is so bad off, he can't keep his own property. You're bailing him out, it's not going to bail him out. So what do we do now that he's in this deep financial trouble? He is so poor, according to verse 39, such dire straits, I like that old phrase, that he's willing to sell himself to a family member. And verse 39 is clear. The enslavement of a family member is out of the question. You are not to profit by your brother's misfortune. So, no, you can't buy him and make him a slave. Not an option. Instead, verse 40 says, the relative who has money must hire him. He may come to you and go, Lord, I'll just make me a slave. No, you got to hire him. Does this kind of maybe fit into your reading of the story of the prodigal son? Because what's he come back and say? I'll be a servant. And dad not only welcomes back with open arms, not only does he give to him prodigiously, the story's about the prodigal father, not the prodigal son really, but there's no way dad's going to treat his son like a slave. The principles are here in the basic fundamental level already. So he's got to hire him. And so what that statement precludes is actually two things. One, it precludes slavery. He can't be a slave. But it also precludes, and it's going to sound bad, let me qualify it here in a second, charity. Because what happens when you continually give somebody charity? What are you really doing? You're either enabling them or you're enslaving them, right? Who owns you? The person you owe money to. And so if I keep feeding you and keep you down because I'm not helping you climb up, I'm keeping you a slave to me, even if you're not working for me for free, so to speak. This is what a lot of third world countries are now telling missionary agencies in the West. Quit sending money. Quit sending vacation missionaries. Come teach us how to drill our own wells. Come teach us how to grow our own crops. Otherwise, we're never going to break this cycle of dependency on you. And it's embarrassing to them. Some of you hate when somebody offers you help or support or money. Imagine your entire life existence is dependent on somebody from another place going, we're here to save you. And so, Bible's already dealing with that. What, doing the math in my head real quick, roughly 3,500 years ago. Don't enable, encourage. Help, maybe when it costs you something, because maybe you don't need another employee, but don't do it in such a way that you lord it over them. And how long is this arrangement supposed to last? To the year of Jubilee. So this could be 49 years, or it could be 2 years. Because what happens in the year of Jubilee? He gets his land back, he gets set free of the arrangement you're working through, and he gets a fresh start, him or his children. And so this is a temporary situation. In that year, according to verse 41, the brother is set free from what I've got air quoted there, his debt to the clansman. You bailed me out, I owe you, brother. But in the year of Jubilee, the debt's paid. Because as we saw with the year Jubilee requirements earlier, God's the one who actually really paid the debt. And so he and his family are then to have their land restored to them. It's a reset. In many cases, what we're doing still today is we're not giving people a reset. We're helping them, but we're not making them better. And so there's always that fine line between the two. And the reason these rules apply, according to verse 42, is the people we're talking about, all people, belong to God, not their relatives. Because they belong to God, they can't be sold into slavery. It's not for them to sell themselves, because they don't own themselves. They're not even their own to buy or sell. So every financial decision they make, it has to be made in light of relationship with God. Every employment decision made in light of their relationship with God and so forth. Because of that, because they belong to God, verse 42, verse 43 says, since they belong to God, you, the benefactor, the one who helps them, you can't rule over them ruthlessly. For the sake of time, we won't answer the longer question, but I want you to think about it. What's the modern application of that? The idea of ruling over somebody ruthlessly. Pick an example, think about what that might look like at work, or in the case of a student-professor relationship, whatever. What does that look like? What's the principle we get at? Because we're not looking at the land, we're not looking at the year of Jubilee in our context, but what's the principle of this rule that we should adhere to and obey? Verse 44 is where the paragraph gets sticky, because we know about our American history and past. First read, verse 44, slavery is not explicitly forgiven. Because he talks about buying them, owning them. But remember, in biblical terms, in the ancient world, in Hebrew, in the Old Testament, slaves and servants are words used almost interchangeably. Paul talks about himself being a bond servant to God. John MacArthur, several years ago, maybe 15 now, wrote a book called Slave. The idea of I'm enslaved to God because he bought me. They use them interchangeably. Bless you, whoever that was. And so, if we're using the word slave and servant here interchangeably, what we might actually be talking about is forced labor, slavery. No, hired labor, servitude. I'm hiring you to serve me. And so it's not talking about buying somebody to be your slave. You're hiring somebody, still costing you money, to be your servant, which then matches the principle above with the brother, right? Don't enslave him, pay him. And so the picture here is probably better for us to understand that what's being described in this paragraph is indentured servitude. Right? Many of the early pilgrims came to the colonies, sold their lives to the merchants for 5 years, 10 years, guaranteeing him, I will work for you until I've paid off my debt. And so they sold themselves in one figure of speech, but they're not slaves in terms of what was the American South system, chattel slavery. Chattel. Because notice even here when he's talking about these people from other nations or even the sojourners among them, these people are selling themselves into slavery. This is not you being captured as an enemy in war and being sold as a slave, which is how most of the slaves came to the colonies. They were captured in war in Africa. The winners sold them to the white people from Europe. They brought them here, sold them to somebody else. The people that are being described in this paragraph are selling themselves. That's the same case of the brother at the beginning of the paragraph. Because he's a brother, you don't buy him, you hire him. Down here, he is giving permission. If somebody comes to you and wants to sell themselves in this way, you're allowed to do it. But even then, the rules are going to still almost sound very parallel to me as we go through this. And the issue is here, the ones who are selling themselves to you that you can, air quote, purchase, they're coming from where? Other nations. These are people not in the covenant relationship with God. You treat family different than you treat your neighbor a little bit. Not radically, but a little bit. Sojourners, verse 45, people who are living among you can also sell themselves into this form of slavery, in this form of service. And verse 45 seems to include some sort of right of ownership. Again, not that you own them as property, but you have a contract with them in a sense. I will work for you for 20 years if you provide my room, housing, and an allowance. And how long do they have to work for you? 20 years. And so in essence, what do? They own you. And this contractual agreement can be passed from generation to generation, verse 46 says. There's no year of Jubilee out. You can get these people, and they could be yours forever, depending on what the nature of the selling agreement was. And then he again reiterates in verse 46, Israelites may not treat Israelites that way. Verse 46, though, again, comes back to the fact that they shouldn't be treated ruthlessly. So this excludes American slavery, doesn't it? The idea of treating them ruthlessly is out the window. And that language of ruthlessly, Exodus chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, uses that exact term to describe the way the Egyptians treated the Israelites when they were owned by the people of Egypt. And so it's one of those, you didn't like it when somebody did it to you, so don't do it to somebody else. Don't do it to your brother. Don't even do it to the sojourner or the person from another nation. Right? This is kind of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would want done unto you. And so we're talking about brothers in trouble, financial. Brothers in trouble so bad they're desperate. Hey man, I'll sell you myself. And you're supposed to say, no, you won't. But even the one who you can buy, if you will, into service, you still don't treat him like Egypt treated the slaves. That's not American slavery. One more paragraph yet tonight. Verse 47. If a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger or the sojourner with you, or to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from the clan may redeem him. Or if he grows rich, he may redeem himself. He shall calculate with this buyer from the year when he sold himself to him until the year of Jubilee. And the price of his sale shall vary with the number of years. The time he was with his owner shall be rated as the time of a hired worker. Notice again, we keep talking about being sold, but we still keep describing them as hired workers. Is a hired worker. If there are still many years left, he shall pay proportionally for his redemption some of his sale price. If there remain but a few years until the year of Jubilee, he shall calculate and pay for his redemption in proportion to his years of service. He shall treat him as a worker hired year by year. He shall not rule ruthlessly over him in your sight. If he is not redeemed by these means, then he and his children with him shall be released in the year of Jubilee. For it is to me that the people of Israel are servants. They are my servants who I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So here's another possible scenario. Verse 47, poor Israelites could choose to sell themselves to the strangers or sojourners living in Israel, the promised land. So you can't buy him. You have to hire him as an employee. Maybe he needs more money than you're willing to offer or able to offer. He could theoretically sell himself into a relationship with a stranger or sojourner. If that happens and you find out about it as a relative, you can go purchase his freedom. In other words, the idea here is, as the relative, you can come in and settle the debt owed. To us, you go, you took your car to the money store. Horrible decision. But now it's too late. You signed the paperwork. You can swoop in and pay off the debt and get the title back. Problem resolved. According to verse 49, this person who sold himself to the stranger can also buy himself if he acquires the wealth to do so. Notice, if he's able to buy himself and if he's able to acquire wealth, is he treated as property or as an employee? He's an employee of some sort, right? It may be harder to buy yourself back in this situation. It's like when, the old days, 100 years ago or more, you get sent to the poorhouse because you failed to pay your bills, and you have to stay at the poorhouse till you pay your bills. And you go, how's that supposed to work? You're supposed to work. They just now know where you're at. And so you could accumulate enough wealth to eventually buy yourself back, to pay off your debt, to get yourself released from this contract. And as with the case of the land earlier in chapter 25, the redemption price should be prorated. If you sold yourself 48 years ago and you got 2 years left on the contract, you don't need to pay the 50-year deal. It's prorated. And so what you're looking at is the date of the sale, the contract, and the time left until the year of Jubilee, how many years till I'm going to be free anyway. Take those 2 dates into consideration and pay it back proportionately. This way, and again, air quotes, the buyer, the person who bought this Israelite for service, doesn't actually lose money because of the redemption. Is that what's going on in the American South, slavery? No, it's always about how much more money can I make. This is not about that. This is about honoring a contract and paying what is actually due. So the principle here may be pay your debts as much as anything. Verse 53 reiterates something we've already seen. He, the one who sells himself to the stranger, is basically to be treated like an employee, a hired worker, not property. Again, this is not American slavery being described here. And the key word, again, is, verse 53, ruthlessly. And since this is going on in the midst of the Israelites in the Promised Land, other Israelites are required to ensure it doesn't happen ruthlessly. If you see it happening, you need to step in and help resolve the situation. If he can't raise enough money, his debt's too great, whatever, he and his family are ultimately, though, to be released when? In the Jubilee. So even the stranger and sojourner has to live by those rules because they're living in the land. The reason of all this being true, according to verse 55, the Israelites ultimately belong to God as servants. I don't have a blank here, but in other words, this is about stewardship. He owns them. They are to treat them in light of God's ownership, not theirs. He brought them out of Egypt. He rescued them. And the cost of their redemption, their purchase price, was the death of the firstborn, wasn't it? To buy them, somebody had to die. And of course, what's our C word? This is a covenant matter. You're in a relationship with me, it changes all your other relationships. So, we don't have Jubilee, we don't have the Sabbath year, but is there really a principle here that we can't apply in our modern circumstances? Forgiveness, charitable treatment, taking care of our own, treating even outsiders with respect and dignity. This is not an irrelevant book. This is just a book we have to work a little harder to make sure we understand what they're really talking about. Misreading part of this passage tonight cost millions of Africans their lives. And today, it probably costs a lot of Christians the ability to say, all Scripture is God-breathed and profitable for me. We need to read it, ask God what He meant, and then ask God, what's it got to do with me? All right, let's go ahead and pray and head on home. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you again for this evening, for, Lord, the opportunity, the privilege to pray for one another, and, Lord, to spend another half hour or so in your word, working our way slowly, hopefully carefully, trying to, Lord, mine the riches of your word. Lord, to separate that which is around the gold from that which, Lord, is just there to carry the gold to us. Help us, Lord, recognize the truth as you've revealed it. Lord, what it is that you want us to do with it. And we pray, Lord, that you would use the Scripture for us profitably, teaching us, correcting us, reproving us, making us like Jesus. For it's in His name we live and pray. Amen.